I had a conversation with a colleague a number of years back when we were driving through Norfolk, Virginia, actually, and there's roads that are, they measure flooding in hours per week in some of those areas. And you could feel the sea coming, right? And I actually cried because I could just like see the sea. And I asked my colleague, I said, what are we even doing? You know, like, why are we doing this? Because it's all going to be gone eventually. And he said, there's people living here now, Carly. Like, they have lives here now. There's a vibrant community here now. I mean, we all die, whatever, you know, everything cycles through. So we have to protect this now. And I think we can't think of planning as like a one-time thing. One and we're done and we're good to go, guys. You know, I mean, risk is dynamic. We are waking up. We now know that like these maps they should not be maps. They should be more like some dynamic models.
So we're going to have just a Q&A session here. I'm going to give the three of you a little bit of a heads up. I guess I should introduce you first. Carly Foster from Arcadis, originally a Dutch engineering firm, now an international Dutch engineering firm, has worked both with Paul on the harbor barrier study and also the South Boston / Seaport resilience plan that I'm going to ask you about in a minute. Katie Cho is the city engineer for the Public Works Division, and she's been spearheading a new initiative to set common resilience standards for citywide public works projects. We're going to hear more about that. And you know who Paul is, so we'll come back to him in the Q&A session. So, Carly, I'll start with you, if I may. And I'm just going to roam around. I'll try to get out of the way on this side, if I can. But so you've been heading up this maybe year-long project to investigate both the challenges of protecting the seaport and what to do about it. So, can we protect the seaport?
So there's no silver bullet. There's going to need a layered resilience strategy here. But what we're really looking at and what we found is that it needs to start at the waterfront. The first line of defense really needs to start at the waterfront. And that's because most of the seaport is fill. It's all pretty flat. There's no higher ground to tie into. And so really you don't gain anything by working your way further in. And the property owners at the front really don't want to be wet all the time.
So what sort of systems or design concepts did you all come up with?
So we've broken up the seaport into various planning zones, and the seaport is really unique in the sense that we've got almost every waterfront typology in the same district, and the different property owners, different uses, different technical constraints, and so there's multiple options that are actually possible within each of these planning zones. Really, the toolkit of options ranges from your simple seawalls. There is the option for potential land building. There's some regulatory change that may be required for that. There's the tightening and sister walls adjacent to buildings, and then a lot of opportunities for improvement to the public realm.
So when Paul talks about walls, which I always urge him not to use that word, that's sort of a broad concept for a lot of different things, which could include grassy berms and trees and open space solutions that are elevated.
Think of the technical approach as more of sort of the skeleton. You've got kind of three basic elements to the design. You've got the technical approach that could be, a wall. You've got the alignment, which is sort of where it's happening. And then you've got the actual design, which is everything that you're going to see in the way that you actually engage in the solution.
So our guest from Manhattan this morning concluded his talk with some really interesting comments about the basic dilemma that you're faced in these kinds of projects. And that is, everybody wants to maintain their sight line. That's why they've located along the water, yet they want to be safe and they want to be protected. You had a lot of engagement of property owners and residents and workers in the seaport. Did you hit that same dilemma?
We did. Actually, that was kind of one of the first hurdles that we sort of looked at. The big question is, do we really want to put this stuff at the waterfront, or can we work further back? And so we asked the question of, okay, well, what is the potential recurrence or the frequency of flooding that could happen at the waterfront? And if we wanted to prevent this flooding from entering the property, approximately how high would we need to go just to prevent kind of the average monthly high tide, for example? And we found that in some areas that intervention is about 3 feet high. the folks that we engaged did not want to be flooded that often or to the depth that we were looking at.
So, and then to make it really clear for people, Paul talked about NAV 12, NAV 14, NAV 10. How much sea level rise did you all conclude we could design against and to protect the seaport?
So we looked at three kind of basic elevations, sort of three planning elevations. One was 9 inches of sea level rise, which is expected around the 2030s. And the 1% annual chance event there. And depending on where you're at in the seaport, that can be at different heights, right? We looked at also 40 inches of sea level rise, the expected in 2070s, the 1% annual chance event, and then also kind of a modular idea above that. So the target elevation that we're going for is the 40 inches of sea level rise expected around the 2070s with the possibility to be adapted higher over time. And that ranges anywhere from sort of 3 to 6 feet in height, depending on where you're at along the seaport.
So there's a good deal of room to increase the height if we had to over time.
Yes, so there's some areas where space has been reserved. Our highest priority area is, there's two high priority areas that we're focusing on. One is the Fort Point Channel and an area on the western edge of Seaport Boulevard where those areas currently face relatively high current flood risk. And we've seen that in the recent winter storm events where those two areas were inundated. The area along the Fort Point Channel, I think, was inundated about 4 times during the course of our project. And so I forgot your question, actually.
We'll come back to it.
Sure.
Good. All right. So let me give you a break. I'll shift to Katie. So the city, did a really remarkable job, and actually Carly did a lot of the work on doing a citywide vulnerability assessment in what I call Climate Ready Boston Phase 1, which was a lot of technical analysis to figure out who, what, and where are vulnerable from the climate risks as we go forward. So from your perspective of somebody who sort of oversees the city's assets, its infrastructure around the harbor, what did you draw from that in terms of what some of the biggest challenges might be?
Well, I think the biggest challenge really is how do we take that plan and move it into action? And that's what this first step in developing the resilient design standards for public works is. And the challenge that we ran into in that development was that Public Works actually does not own a whole lot of coastal property. In fact, we might not actually own any coastal property. And so how do we protect the city's assets and the city right-of-way and the mobility that's required through that right-of-way when we don't actually have control over the property that needs to be built on? So that was the challenge that we were trying to tackle with the resilient design standards, was how do we get property owners on the coast to protect the property that's behind them for the public benefit.
So what does that mean exactly?
That's a hard question.
Good.
What it means is that as projects come through for city approvals, whether that's through the BPDA, whether that's through the Public Improvement Commission, resiliency will now be taken into consideration, and that those projects will need to conform to these resilient design standards that Public Works is putting in place.
And I presume those standards included more things than just sea level rise? Or will include?
They will include. Right now, we're really focused on flooding and hardening our coast. So we've looked at 4 different sort of standard designs that we are looking favorably upon. They will be very site specific, so we're not telling people what to do, but we're giving some good options that the city looks favorably upon. Starting with berms and raised harbor walk, and really improving the public space at the same time as protecting properties. There are places where walls are very important and maybe the only option, so walls are in there. We have looked at raised roadways. There are not many opportunities in Boston to do that. They're very difficult. They're very expensive. I don't anticipate that's going to be one that happens very often. And then in limited circumstances, deployable barriers.
Good. So one of the interesting issues I see around town that people don't think about a lot are bridges. And as the water rises under bridges over time, what do we do about that? This hit me home very personally. I had a brand new German sailboat about 10 years ago when I went out under the then Long Island Bridge. And it was very high tide, and as we were approaching the bridge, it occurred to me that I didn't know how high my mast was with the antenna on it. So we got out the German manual And quickly, fortunately I had somebody on board who knew German and could translate to English, and it was 49.6 feet, and the clearance under the bridge was 50 feet on the chart, but the chart was 40 years old. And it was pretty clear as we approached the bridge that we would not make it under there because our sea has risen about 10 inches over the last 80 years, maybe 5 inches over the last 30 years or so, 20 years. So you've got the Northern Avenue Bridge slated for construction. You've got the Washington Street Bridge to Charlestown slated for construction. And I recently was asked to join the design task force for, well, the Northern Avenue Bridge, and then you've got the Long Island Bridge that the mayor wants to put out to the islands. So are you thinking about this problem?
We have to think about this problem.
Good.
Yes, very much so in all of our bridge designs and all of our infrastructure designs. So those are three wonderful opportunities to put early plans into action. The city owns a lot of bridges and we have a lot of work to be done on them. So as we continue to do construction on our bridges, SeaLevel Rise is one of those design parameters that needs to be taken into consideration.
And one of the interesting questions, just to bring this home, when you go out afterwards, look at the old Northern Avenue Bridge, which you're going to work on, and then the Moakley Bridge next to it. And I think the choice has been made to, if you build a new Northern Avenue Bridge or replace it, make it the same height as Moakley. But that's an interesting dilemma because is Moakley really high enough going forward? So anyway, we'll watch and see what happens on that one. And then we've heard a lot of zeros floating around this morning, billions of dollars for this and billions of dollars for that. Can you give us a rough idea what the city currently spends on public works projects on an annual basis? We heard about the New York this morning that, you know, is a multiple of ours, but roughly what's that number look like?
So taking the bridges out of it, because the bridges typically have state funding and not city funding, we would be in the many hundreds of millions of dollars with the bridges. It's around, let's say, 60, 80 to $100 million a year, depending on the year.
For everything
For
that the city does.
Everything that,
Right.
well, everything that Public Works does. Sorry, that's not the city. Everything that Public Works does on our roads, our sidewalks, basic bridge maintenance.
So if we think about that, and you know, I think we're talking about something like $1 billion to $2 billion of capital expenditures to make our city safe on the shore-based solutions around the inner harbor. That's a big jump from the kind of money that we spend today.
It is a very large jump, and that's obviously one of the largest challenges. We need to take opportunities where we're already doing construction to get our resiliency measures incorporated early on in the project plans, because that's really where they fit most seamlessly into projects. It's also where you can get the most efficiencies with money and funding.
Good. Now let me go back to Paul, who's caught his breath. I don't know, Paul, how much your team looked into it, but do you see any technological changes coming down the pike that might make these barrier systems more effective or more cost effective? Yeah. Got to use your mic, Paul. Yeah.
You know, the evolving technology of these offshore barrier systems, really focused on what's available today and what's the situation in Boston.
All right, so I want to come back to my big question. We have till 3 o'clock, right? So we have plenty of time for Q&A. So if you were mayor of the city of Boston and the Climate Ready Boston team told you that we had $1 billion to $2 billion worth of projects to make East Boston safe, to make Charlestown safe, to make the Seaport safe, and I should add they're going to do one more study of the downtown area from the Fort Point Channel all the way to the Charles River Dam, which is the last big remaining stretch, which is the historic part of Boston and perhaps may be one of the more complicated places to look at. So how would we think about, if you were our mayor, how would we think about prioritizing what needs to be done? And I'll give you some clues. You know, one way to think about that is, well, you obviously go where the biggest risks are. What are the most vulnerable places, right? But then if you think about the presentation this morning and other things we've looked at, you might think about equity and fairness. And where are the most vulnerable populations versus where are others who might easier fund these kinds of solutions on their own. You might think about co-benefits. You know, where are there places where we could just protect us from flooding, or maybe we might create other things and get a double bang for the buck, et cetera. So I've given you a few clues. But Carly, you've worked a lot in other cities, and maybe you can comment a lot about how other cities do this, and then come back to my question.
So I'm not going to dodge the question.
Good.
But I have some suggestions around where you don't have to sit and line everybody up and decide who's getting first, who's getting second, who's getting third. Because I think it's really important to think about leveraging and partnering wherever you can. And what we've learned is that the longer people are engaged, the more invested they become. Invested people become champions, and champions are the ones that drive change. And so it is not just the city's responsibility to protect all of this property and all of our constituents. We had a focus group during the Climate Ready South Boston project, and somebody asked me, well, whose responsibility really is this? And I was like, well, it's yours, and it's yours and yours and yours, and it's all of ours. And so the point about the infrastructure integrating resilience into them is critical, and there's a lot of other potential partnership opportunities, property owners, and so on and so forth. In the way that we've chosen to deal with it in Climate Ready South Boston specifically is those projects, the majority of them need to be implemented really before the 2040s. And the costs are quite high. The options range from a total of about $700 million to protect the entire district to about $1.6 billion. And a lot of that really should be done before 2050. And so we've identified implementation tracks where these projects can be implemented concurrently using strategic partnerships and the folks that are involved. So you've got, the Fort Point Channel and the South Boston Waterfront are really dominated by private property owners. And so we've been focusing on partnership building and leveraging of assets there. The Seaport, Boulevard, Marine Industrial Park, Reserve Channel, those are all dominated by EDIC and Massport ownership. And so a different planning process for implementation needs to happen there. And then DCR really owns the land that is associated with Pleasure Bay and the beaches along Day Boulevard. And they have their own master planning process and their own budget. We've also got the regulatory agencies involved in this planning process. And then, of course, there's the inland solutions. So beyond that, when you do have to think about how to prioritize the city expenditure specifically, there's this idea of squeezing whatever dollars you have out of your existing projects, the refine, refocus, partner, prepare, pursue money for investment, but thinking about where you're going to get the most benefit from an equity perspective and those projects that are most in line with the mission of the city.
So your answer is, I think, a good one. It's, God damn it, staff, get those people from DCR in the room, get those private developers in the room, get my budget people in the room. We're going to work on this together and figure it out.
Yeah, don't try to go it alone.
Don't go. And you had a lot of conversations with private developers and property owners, which include in the Seaport very large companies like Gillette and GE and the Convention Center Authority and lots of others. And what sort of reaction did you get about them doing their part at some point?
It was really interesting. Some of them, this was really in the forefront of their minds. We had a range of property owners, from those that would be there for a couple years to those that were planning to be there for 50 years. And so their perspective on risk and what they should be doing about risk all started from very different places. And so we had to go through sort of this engagement process of making sure that we all really understood where we're sitting from a risk perspective. Some of them had read Climate Ready Boston and said that it was a game changer for them because they were able to really quantify the costs of inaction. And then there were others that Gillette in particular had never flooded. They've been there for 100 years, but in between our first and second meetings, they flooded twice, or their property flooded twice. And so that sort of changed their perspective, and we got them before they started really planning this process. And almost universally, they agreed, the property owners that we had in the room, and we had quite a lot of them, that collective action was going to be a lot more cost-effective and beneficial for them than taking these, trying to deal with this individually. Because even if they protected their individual property, the problem in South Boston is so urgent and expansive that the flood risk will flank whatever properties are not protected and get you from behind or from the side. Your egress is not going to be protected. You may protect your specific assets, but people are not going to be able to get to work. And so they really have to link arms and form a chain. And so we had the people in the room that have the ability to kind of make those decisions and be thinking about it and sitting across the table from each other, really understanding how they need to move forward collectively.
Great, thank you. So Katie, you work in City Hall and you've been in those meetings with the mayor.
Yeah, this is a little unfair question because the mayor's my boss. So, But really, for the city, it all comes down to protecting the people, because the city is the people. And we have started making that shift in our infrastructure asset management view, and putting an equity lens on how we are making our infrastructure investments. And we're doing that really across the board. And I think that resiliency measures are a big piece of that. And start looking at where our vulnerable populations are. And so I would start really with the focus on the people.
Well, I think one of the hardest challenges in all this that I've learned working with Climate Ready Boston the last several years is a big fraction of the vulnerable buildings in these flood risks areas are older double, triple, quadruple decker houses. Maybe the owner lives on site, maybe it's an absentee landlord, et cetera. I don't know whether you've touched upon this in the standard setting or otherwise, but how do we take on that challenge of helping those people retrofit their buildings in vulnerable places?
So we, from a public works standpoint, we have to really view things from the mobility and the right-of-way standpoint, but we have been having very real and substantive conversations across the city about the interface of where that public property and private property intersect, and how we do help the people and help the private property owners with resiliency measures. And so, from a public works standpoint, that's not really the direction we are able to go, just with what our sort of authority is. But the city overall is working on that.
I know, and Chris Reed is here from STAS, I know one of the really good things that's happened is that somebody at City Hall put two and two together and said, we want to build the Suffolk Downs site. We want to put a lot of affordable housing on it. We'd love to attract Amazon as well, but we know it's in a low-lying, vulnerable area, so we need to make it as resilient as possible. And I don't know whether you had anything to do with that or you're involved, but
we have found that the places that we have opportunities to build are the places that tend to be the most vulnerable. There's a reason they haven't been built on so far. And so as we look to how do we house the expanding population of the city, which is growing very rapidly, we need to make sure that the new housing that we're building, the new neighborhoods that we are building are resilient and that they are protected. So it is a piece of the planning at the infrastructure level and at the neighborhood level.
great, thank you. All right, so Paul, you're last in line. You're the scientist. The mayor calls. Paul, what do I do?
Okay.
How do I prioritize?
So actually, I'm more of a scientist, engineer, planner here. So a couple of things. I think about taking what I call a whole area approach. It's already been alluded to. You just can't protect the buildings. You've got to protect the infrastructure that the buildings rely upon. People need to be able to get to work. You need to have water, sewer, electricity. So you have to look at protecting a district as opposed to its individual buildings. The second thing is we know the benefit-cost ratios for shore-based adaptation are always good. And so I wouldn't spend a lot of time doing detailed benefit-cost analysis. Also, with this whole area approach, there are the residents there, there's city assets, but there's also the assets of the infrastructure providers, like the MBTA, Massport, DOT. They're going to benefit from these district-wide solutions. They should be funding them. They should be helping to fund them. And these organizations, they have revenue streams. They know how to handle complex projects, or in theory they should. And so I'd certainly build partnerships among the community, the city, and the infrastructure providers, because they're all going to be coordinated, and there's going to be ways to do adaptation that serve multiple needs of these various groups. And so that leaves them, the other point is, we roughly know what areas of the city are going to get flooded over time. So we roughly know how we're going to stage our adaptation. Like we want to do East Boston, parts of East Boston, Charlestown, downtown first, and later on come to other parts of East Boston and so on. So we know roughly the time periods we want to be thinking about adaptation. The third thing we really could consider is the idea of social justice and equity. And this is a really tricky one. And how do you really understand what the residents of an area need, particularly those that are from marginalized populations? So one of the things we're doing in East Boston under the Neighborhood Affordable Housing Project is we're actually holding neighborhood charrettes. And we're really strongly trying to go out and do a grassroots effort to develop, work with the neighborhood. What do they want their neighborhood to look like to deal with coastal flooding? And the other thing is, I would tell the mayor, we can't be cheap. Too often we skimp on planning and then we spend bundles on construction. And if we're really clever, we can do clever planning, which is we're going to cut down the construction costs in the future. So it's really important that we invest in planning and public outreach to make sure we have equitable solutions that protect all the interests in the city.
Anyone else want to add anything before we move to the audience?
I just wanted to mention something to be thinking about when we're thinking about social justice issues is that we can't just think about specifically where people live, because our lowest income and most vulnerable people often their job and the reliance on their job is as important sometimes as, you know, the safety of their home. And a lot of the lower income jobs they cannot be relocated. Like maybe they work for a restaurant that is really dependent on access in that place. It's very place based. And so you have to think about the entire network that these folks really rely on. And so South Boston, for example, is often thought of as a place that is kind of where the wealthier people live. Like, why would we focus, why would we invest here versus, East Boston or somewhere else? But there's a huge concentration of jobs and economic activity there that have to be protected coincident with residential areas.
And I think that that's where the transportation infrastructure comes in and the right-of-way and the protection of the right-of-way and maintaining mobility for those same reasons.
Right, and I think that's where Paul's point is so important. You know, if you're going to protect the Blue Line stations over at Maverick and, you know, the center of East Boston, and you're going to protect the critical infrastructure at Logan Airport, and those agencies have revenue streams that East Boston doesn't have, how can we apply that to protect everybody? I'll never forget the first sort of meetings we had in East Boston. We thought we knew that we were there to help, protect people's homes, and many people in East Boston said, forget about my home. If my basement floods, that's not a big problem. If Logan closes for 3 weeks and I don't have any income, that's a really big problem. And if I can't get across the harbor in the subway to my job, I've got an even bigger problem. So it's right. It's not just where they live, but where they work. So I'm going to try to set a good precedent for the other panels and leave 21 minutes for Q&A. So does anybody know how that's going to work? Do we have a mic that has to go around? Or
It's ironic that you're talking about East Boston and social justice and how do you know what the folks of a neighborhood want, especially if you don't ask them. And one of the things that you said from the DPW is that you protect, your whole mission and goal is to protect the people of a neighborhood or a community. And we feel like that's not completely happening in one neighborhood along the Chelsea Creek in East Boston, where a substation, an electrical substation, is being proposed on a site that is slated to be inundated with water next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel, and in a very low income and ethnically diverse neighborhood. Almost every single neighborhood or small census group in East Boston identifies as an environmental justice community. And if you or the mayor asked folks if they wanted that substation, you would hear a very loud no. And the folks in that neighborhood don't feel at all as if the city of Boston is trying to protect their interests. So can you please explain to me how that is even being considered, especially given ISO New England's new reports, which say that we don't need substations like this? So why are we building substations in environmental justice neighborhoods right next to 8 million gallons of jet fuel in a neighborhood that clearly doesn't want that?
So I may need to punt this one a little bit because I have not been involved in this discussion. So I don't have a great answer on that. I do know that we do try and engage with every neighborhood, and our engagement with East Boston has been fairly extensive on environmental issues because of the vulnerability of the neighborhood and the people that live there. But in terms of that specific substation, I do not have I don't have an answer on that.
You know,
sorry.
A commissioner friend from New York, alluded to the same challenge this morning in that you can't just hold a public meeting and assume all the people from the neighborhood are there. You know, in most cases, it's going to be the same cast of characters that go from meeting to meeting. So I think we're all obligated in whatever capacities we are to make sure we are outreaching and engaging in as many, many ways as we can. And it's not just through the sort of public meeting process. But I don't know, Mitch, whether you have any great insight on how to do that, that could help us from New York. Yeah.
Well, again, what I said earlier, we do have the benefit of having outreach coordinators. That is expensive, and not everyone can do it. But we just form a relationship. Almost, I would say, majority of our parks have friends groups, and they're locally based in the community. And so on any given issue, we reach out to our networks, and we do collect their names. and they tend to reach out with a number of organizations. We also have our both Facebook, Twitter. I mean, we have over 300,000 followers, and so we have subtle ways of getting the word out to engage the public. And we also, I didn't say this earlier, but we nickname ourselves not just the Department of Parks and Rec, but Department of Fun, Health, and Happiness. And it's our goal to be the Department of Fun, so we establish a very good rapport with the public. And as a result, we get a lot of good feedback. When we call for public meetings, we tend to get some great responses, but it's relationships that we form through our gardeners, through our park workers that tend to be our ambassadors, as well as our friends groups, and that's the way we're able to touch many, many New Yorkers, as well as our special events. So we have ambassadors of friends out there that we reach out to, so when we do have a public meeting, we can make sure that we reach out to all races, all incomes, all colors, all cultures, so that tends to benefit a great deal.
At the risk of sounding or saying the same thing over and over again, which I tend to do, but I would like to just mention that in Charlestown, it is just really the trapped area that is being addressed, and the place where people live is not. Okay. Brings up the second part of that, which is that part of the area in the Navy Yard, which is all on the water, is federal. And no one has mentioned getting government involved. The same thing in the North End, federal. And the flooding in Charlestown in the Navy Yard is mostly toward the federal side. So how are we going to engage them?
So I put Mitch on the spot. Is Mike Creasy still here? He was here earlier. He's hiding. He's your dear friend. The regional head of the National Park Service here. You want to comment on that?
We're working very closely with Lois on...
Put it back to me, Ed. Yeah.
I think it's a serious problem. I think that we've been with the task force and following Paul's study both for the Harbor Islands as well as the shoreline. And, you know, it's very challenging. We have these cultural resources that are meant to be both protected and preserved into the future, and at the same time think about landscape alterations that's going to prevent sea level rise inundating these places. So it's a huge challenge for us, and we're not there yet.
The other part of it is places like the Navy Yard that are so developed don't have a lot of space to put in things. That, you know, I live on a pier over the water. There is nothing around me that you can put in soft. And the only thing you can do is build up maybe walls around the pier. I don't know how you do it. How do you retrofit? Because new buildings may go in there, but mostly it's old buildings, and they have basements that flood because it's also coming through the ground. You know, we have all our utilities are always being affected. So it's a big challenge being there.
Yeah, that's one of the things that we really had to take into consideration with the design standards that we're putting forth is the things that make Boston unique, and that is really the existing buildings, the proximity of those existing buildings and historic resources to the water, and how you know we can't build a bunch of parks because we don't have the space to build a bunch of parks in most cases. And so there's a place for walls, and as much as we don't want them and as much as we don't want to talk about them, there are times that is our only option. And the list of design considerations in this new guidelines that will be coming out is actually longer than the design standards themselves, because everything is so unique and so site specific. So what we've put forth is a list of considerations that just have to be taken into account every time a design is done.
Paul, in your summary of findings, you dwelled mostly on the pros and cons of the outer barrier, including the 2050 completion date, which strikes me as a little remote. But could you say a little more about the pros and cons of the inner barrier?
Yeah, the inner barrier stretches from Logan to the Seaport, and that would have the same problems with having to close more frequently as time went on. It obviously wouldn't change the tidal regime too much because it's essentially the gate opening would be over the channel. It would have more environmental consequences because the area upstream of the gate, the volume upstream of the gate, the harbor area upstream of the gate, is relatively small compared to the entire volume of the harbor. So during an event like a coastal storm, if we also had major rainfall, you'd have all the freshwater inflow coming in from the Charles Mystic and the Neponset, as well as the overland flow. And so you'd have a volume problem. And so you have to put pumps for the inner barrier system to pump that water over the barrier, similar to what they have right now for the Charles and Mystic. Also, besides having this additional quantity of water, the water coming in would probably be of pretty low quality because of combined sewer overflows And even if they've managed the CSOs, there'll still be problems with non-point source pollution from an urban area, which tends to be quite polluted. And so you'd have this poor quality water coming in as well. And it wouldn't be possible to pump this poor quality water out into the harbor, given the hydraulics, the way pumps are set up. So you have this little moment, a couple of hours, or it could be a couple of days if it's a nor'easter, where you have this concentrated volume of water that's fairly low quality building up behind the inner barrier, which could cause local water quality problems over that period. And so it would certainly magnify any environmental impacts that a barrier system would have. Is that helpful?
It is. And was the cost-benefit comparison of barrier versus shore-based, which seemed pretty one-sided for the outer barrier, any different for the inner?
Yeah, no, actually, the graph, I went through the table, I went through it rather quickly, and I apologize for that. For the inner barrier, I was surprised as well. The inner barrier, the benefit cost ratios for the 7% discount rate, which are compared to the shore-based solutions, is all well less than 1. And the reason there's not much difference between the benefit cost ratios for the inner and the outer is that we're only looking at the city of Boston, okay? But for the inner, we protect both barrier systems, the outer and the inner, protect a lot of the interior parts of Boston because we're blocking off flood pathways. So both the inner and the outer actually protect some of the same areas.
Sure. Walter Hope with the Friends of the Boston Harbor Islands. If you look at some of the tools that are online when you change the sea level rise, Boston goes back to being its original shape. The Back Bay goes back to Back Bay. Charlestown goes back to being a peninsula, which we're about to become because of bridge work. South Boston goes back to being underwater all the way back to Roxbury. What is the economic value of the jobs that are formed in these areas, plus the value of the buildings and structures and infrastructure in these areas? And is it trillions of dollars versus 20 billion to build a wall and a barrier?
Carl, you want to answer that, having done the analysis for Climate Ready Boston, et cetera?
I wanted to comment on there are values for that in Climate Ready Boston, and I wanted to point out some significant limitations of the benefit cost analysis that we did for the harbor barrier study. It's all based on the existing built environment, and there are some assumptions that artificially depress the benefits, such as because the scale of the study area is so large, we had to take kind of median structure size for a tract. And what we know is that properties on the waterfront, especially in South Boston, for example, are much larger than the properties that are further back from the waterfront. So the benefits of the harbor barrier, the quantifiable benefits are probably significantly higher, but not necessarily enough to make it that we would forego the shoreline solutions. One of the things that we did in the benefit cost analysis for the harbor barrier solution was any area that we identified as would be flooding more frequently than maybe a couple times a month, once a month or a couple times a month, we remove those from the analysis because you would not keep receiving the same damages over and over again to that property. You would lose the use of that property. And there's a lot of places, it was a huge amount of benefits that were removed because the value of that property would just be gone. And so we did not quantify the reverberating economic benefits of that. We looked specifically at kind of that recurrent property damage.
So, and then I remember the specific numbers from Climate Ready Boston prior to this barrier study. The 1% storm hitting in 2070 with, I think, plus or minus 3 feet of sea level rise was $85 billion worth of damage, potential damage, pretty much based on today's market values, not escalating them over time, and assuming everyone in those properties recovered and got back to work within 30 days, which was a pretty, generous assumption. So it's a big number. Yeah.
I just want to add, we're well aware of the limitations of the benefit analysis done for the harbor-wide barrier, but with those benefit cost ratios being so low, even if you increase them by 2 or 3 or 4, even 5 times in some cases, we're still generally below 1.
Right.
plus the other advantages of the shore-based solutions, besides the cost, certainly outweigh, I think, the barrier.
What I meant to say is that the barrier would not protect that loss of use because you could not close the barrier. It would be permanently closed in order to protect those properties from being completely lost. It could only prevent sort of this recurrent damage. Even our assumptions were that it would be closing more than actually would be technically feasible at this point in time. So.
Okay, does anybody have a non-barrier question?
SeaLevel Rise is really coastal retreat at some point. So there's going to be some moment when it's not worth making the wall higher. At that point, what's now our most expensive real estate drops to zero in value. Is there anything we should be doing up front to prevent real estate and property tax bubble?
Interesting line of thinking. I had a conversation with a colleague a number of years back when we were driving through Norfolk, Virginia, actually, and there's roads that are, they measure flooding in hours per week in some of those areas. And you could feel the sea coming, right? And I actually cried because I could just see the sea. And I asked my colleague, I said, what are we even doing? Why are we doing this? Because it's all going to be gone eventually. And he said, there's people living here now, Carly. They have lives here now. There's a vibrant community here now. I mean, we all die, whatever, everything cycles through. So we have to protect this now. And I think we can't think of planning as a one-time thing. One and we're done and we're good to go, guys. Risk is dynamic. We are waking up. We now know that these maps they should not be maps. They should be more like some dynamic models, right? And so we have to reassess consistently over time what our needs are and how we need to think about these buildings. And we need, if there's a point at which retreat becomes necessary, we need to anticipate that years in advance and have it be controlled versus there's areas that I'm working now that were not a controlled, managed retreat. They were not planned for, and they're just a mess now, and the only people that are left are the ones that could not afford to leave. So I guess the answer is it's an iterative process. You have to engage the people that are living there now to understand what their needs are. We're going through a lot of this in Louisiana right now, and we don't have an answer, but it's an active conversation, and these are the questions really of our century and this year.
I was thinking about this term managed retreat, which is a wonderful euphemism, the other night during the mayor's summit, and here's what got me thinking about it. We were talking about the need for more housing, and I think it was Mayor Walsh who said, at least within the 495 perimeter area, we need to build 300,000 units of housing just to meet demand over the next 2 decades. So imagine if we had to add to that relocating 25 or 50,000 people out of the waterfront vulnerable zone in Boston, how much more complex and challenging that task would be. You can solve that problem?
Thought of something that I wanted to add to that conversation. One of the things that we've been talking about a lot recently is not just about building resilience on the coast, but building resilience in the receiving areas, because this is a process that is happening right now in some areas. And so those, rather than thinking about necessarily always kind of what's happening right at the coast, it's what's happening in these other areas, and are they prepared for the population that's coming? Do they have the park space that people are going to want to have? Make these places really exciting for people to live and go to, and that has to be a part of the planning process.
And I would add to that, we are looking at resilience not just as an infrastructure problem or a physical problem, but as we're trying to make our population resilient at the same time. We're looking at the people as well as our hardscape and our parks and our greenscape. So we're trying as a city to be very comprehensive in how we really view the concept of resiliency and how we build a resilient city.
Great, thank you. Got time for 1 or 2 more questions. In the back, yes, sir.
Just thinking of the number of reports and things that have come out over the past number of years. I've got a box of them at home going back about 10 years to a UNH study about climate change and the effects in Boston and the area. I sort of feel like in the television drama at this point, the patient's on the table and people should be gelling up the paddles and saying, screaming clear. And we're saying, well, I think maybe they should be cutting back on their statins and maybe running a bit more and changing their diet. Like when do we actually start seeing this stuff on the ground? Because in East Boston, at least, we're seeing more and more development right on the waterfront. We're seeing proposals, vacant lots that have proposals, the one that's been mentioned, and others that don't seem to gel with what we've been hearing and seeing at these kinds of meetings. And so I'm wondering when the rubber actually hits the road and we start going, because it feels a little bit like Wile E. Coyote running and it's not taking off at any point.
So the development that's going on in East Boston was the catalyst for the Public Works Resilient Design Standards, because we saw an opportunity there that was going to be missed, and we really couldn't let that pass. So that is the thing that said, you have to jump off the cliff now. You have to actually get this started, and we're trying to be in line with all of these amazing planning studies that have gone on. We're definitely in line with Climate Ready Boston. We are lining up with the work that's going on in the Seaport, the work that's going on in East Boston, but we couldn't necessarily wait for getting the funding for a $200 million long-term vision in place, right? So, so the resilient design standards are the way that we start implementing the plans that are out there that we've been working on for so long. Public Works is not the be-all, end-all with this. We are the start. So, and as you can see, there's limits to what Public Works itself can do. But once we set those standards, once we start working with the rest of the city, the rest of the departments on these standards, we're hoping that they start growing and become a citywide standard and not just something that Public Works is the champion of.
Carly, could you talk about how perhaps insurance, flood insurance, could be a tool that could be used in a long-term planning scheme for organizing retreats?
I can speak a little bit to it. I can tell you kind of our engagement in that is evolving. Insurance has historically not looked forward, and we've spoken with a number of insurers, and the general consensus is that is expected to continue for quite some time, because they are getting premiums to address risk now, not necessarily risk over time. There is the potential for using kind of cost savings from risk-adjusted premiums. Actually, David Levy, sitting in front of you, could probably speak in a lot more detail to this. We started engaging with insurers during the Climate Ready South Boston project pretty heavily, realized that it was a much longer term conversation, and tabled it to be picked up again later.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. The insurance industry sector is not yet a big factor in terms of, I think, on-site decisions about where to locate and where to build or not to build, in Boston at least. You would think it would be in Miami and places like that, but obviously maybe not there either. And it's partly for the reasons that Carly stated. They can only set premiums on an annual basis, and they look backward rather than forward. So there's a lot of change that I think that has to come there also.
Increase them over time. There's also markets that are being artificially supported by investment from kind of outside the country and other areas. So the market is not necessarily reacting in all cases to this risk appropriately. But cities like Boston, who are on the leading edge of being transparent about risk and being active in addressing that risk, are really changing that. One area that we are seeing some potential for impact is in bond ratings. So they've come right out and said that the bond ratings of cities will be affected by their kind of planning around resilience. We're not necessarily seeing that right now, but it's been said. So, you know, I'd be interested in looking there. And then one other financing mechanism is the potential for entities to use kind of long-term financing of resilience to fund some retirement funds. There's actually some kind of investment companies that are emerging that are looking to invest in resilience opportunities for that purpose, because it's a longer-term opportunity for them.
Great. Okay, so I think the last comment from me, to reiterate something Paul said, there's a link between resilience and the mitigation side of climate. And the really ultimate, most important thing we need to do as a city and as a state and as a country and as a world is reduce the emissions of the gases that cause climate change in the first place. That gets us off those really worst case trajectories and down on the lower slope, and dealing with 2 feet of sea level rise is going to be a whole lot easier than 3, 4, 5, 6, or even 7 feet in this next century. So fortunately, the city also has a project called Carbon Free Boston. The Green Ribbon Commission is helping with that as well. It's doing a lot of modeling that will be finished in October, and that's really focused on how do we get to zero by 2050 on the emission side of the equation. So keep an eye on that as well. How am I doing? I'm on time? Thank you all. Take care.